Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So, the more you dig, the more you find. Sometimes the things that you find are going to be things that you appreciate. Other things, it might have hit you the wrong way. You might find some things that you really didn't want to see. Okay. So just continuing in my, let's say, investigation of, some social movements that go on in Brazil, racial politics, and, just an assortment of things that's coming out of the political left these days. I've come across quite a bit of intriguing information. And I don't, for some people who are considering themselves hardcore, just leftist, maybe this news would be no big deal to them. They'll say, like, what's the problem with that? On the other hand, people who look at the world from another perspective may look and say, hey, this is a huge red flag. And the other thing I like to point out is that a lot of movements that you see go on in countries like the United States, you have to understand that these are not just movements that are just simply, held in the United States. People who have a lot of money and have a lot of agendas going on, they fund the same type of movements all over the world. And, this is something that we do have to understand, because it's just like, well, dang, how does this stuff why does it seem like what's happening in one country seems to be happening in another country? And it's not until you take a step back and look beyond what you're going to see on the totally controlled news outlets that you might watch. This is not a topic I'm going to get into right now. And I know I say that a lot, but it's just the point. There's so much information. I can never just cover everything that needs to be talked about. But one thing I want to point out, just something for you to think about. If you remember, I think it was like sometime 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. It probably goes more than that. Just if you start, connecting the dots, you go back to like 2011 or so, when you had this, the Arab Spring that was going on in the Middle East, right? Then within a year or two, then you had the Occupy Wall Street movement that was going on in the US. And then maybe a couple of years after that, you had this huge protest going on in Brazil. Millions of people take it to the streets. It started off as what people believe to be a protest against the increase of public transportation, the prices you had to pay to ride the bus or ride the subway. Okay. I'm sure there were more after that, but these happened, like these three that I just named happened within a period of 3 to 5 years. And, I actually, because of the work that I was doing at the time, I actually went out to participate in some of those Occupy Wall Street, gatherings. I was there. I saw all of the tents laid out. And I was just amazed at how did this thing just spring up out of nowhere? Apparently, what it seemed to. And then, of course, I don't know, sometime in 2020, 21, 2019, I'm not sure. But of course, we all remember the huge protest of the George Floyd murder, you know, uh, Black Lives Matter and that whole thing. Has anybody ever thought, how is it that these type of protest manifestations, demonstrations, and rallies across the country just seem to pop up out of nowhere? Bam, just tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes in some cases, millions of people just out in the protest, right? And then just as quick as these protests come together, they just disappear. How do you explain that? I mean, do people honestly think these are just people decided they'd had enough and they hit the streets, right? Then these movements just dry up as quickly as they came. I mean, has anybody ever thought about that? I know this is like, again, this is not a topic that I'm going to get into here, but once you understand what the fingerprints look like and what the blueprint looks like, you can kind of look and see, okay, it's the same thing at play going on in different countries, because the people who are behind these things, they're not just focused on just one country. This is all about one world. I'm not even going to finish the rest of that statement. I think you probably know where I'm going with that. So I'm going to just leave that there. So To follow this, I'm going to give some more examples of how things that happen in one country can seem to happen in another country, almost, in an identical manner. And again, once you look behind the scenes and you see who the puppet masters are, it just you should be able to figure this out. You call it conspiracy theory if you like, but I've always said you have conspiracy theory and then you have just plain conspiracy. I'm gonna let you figure out what that means. But let's take a look at the internationalization of leftist movements, the funding behind these movements, and some of the same people, some of the same organizations that you'll find, whether you're talking about the United States or Brazil and numerous other countries. There's reports out there just talking about these movements. The funding for these movements is coming not just to Brazil, but to the Caribbean and Latin America as a whole. So I'm sure you're familiar with this name. So let's just take a look at this story. I took this from obviously usually all of my sources are coming from, Brazilian websites or whatever. And then I'll weave in some other material that may be in English just to emphasize the point that I'm making. So check out just the headline. It says in 1 year, multi-billionaire George Soros poured 107 million reais into Brazilian NGOs. What's up with that? I'm sure a lot of you know who George Soros is about, who he is. And if you happen to be on the left political, the left side of the political spectrum, you might look at this and say, well, so what? That's good. He's supporting, movements to change the world. But I'm like, okay, is he really trying to promote the change, positive changes in the world? I mean, I've always, when and I'm not remembering the brother's name right now, but what is his name? I know who it is. I've listened to this record 100 times. The revolution it won't be televised. So when you see certain movements and certain agendas that's plastered all over the TV, it's all over the media, it seems to be in all of the music, then you should know this can't be a real revolution in terms of this is something that all of the people actually support. Because if the revolution won't be televised, then how do you explain this stuff is all over the television then? That should tell you, okay, should we really be supporting this? Okay. Just a few thoughts for you to think about, right? Let me get into this article right now because it's just a lot of information here. It's actually a short article, but it introduces a topic that I'm going to want to explore more in the future. So George Soros in 1 year poured 107 million reais into Brazilian NGOs. Like, okay, why did he do that? Let's get into this. I love this picture. I found this on a site in Brazil, a Brazilian website. I forget, it's Jornal JJN, I think it was. And this is something that I talked about a few days ago in a piece by the Afro-Brazilian conservative Paulo Cruz. And I'm going to make reference to that in a little bit. But what do you get out of this right here? You have George Soros here, and you have three very well-known symbols that come out of the leftist movements. Okay. So to introduce a little bit about, obviously I've known about George Soros for a number of years, but for some of you who just know him as a name or a philanthropist, what is his agenda all about? I have my own ideas. Maybe you have your own ideas, but let's just check out, what some people are saying. George Soros funds movements to disrupt communities was the name of a 2018 article by Rebecca Hagelin of the Washington Times. I didn't take the whole article. I just took bits and pieces that will introduce the main topic that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, obviously, in this part, she's talking more about the United States, but she says, how are illegal immigrants organized so quickly and young voters corralled overnight to demand open borders? I just asked this question. How do you I used to be an organizer. How do you explain how you can just get millions of people out in the streets behind a certain issue, just seemingly just like that, right? Where did the saturation of transgender and pansexual ideology come from? How is it possible that Black Lives Matter seems to be everywhere? Research shows that billionaire Mr. Soros is spending millions to finance a huge grievance and anarchy industry that pretends to be a grassroots justice protest. Pretends to be grassroots justice protest. Now, many of you who I know a lot of people still see Black Lives Matter as a great thing, but I'm saying when you look behind the scenes of what alternative media was saying about what was going on, in the leadership of Black Lives Matter, you should be looking at this and saying, you should smell a rat with this whole thing. I mean, once I discovered what Black Lives Matter, the national organization, was all about, that's when I started speaking out like, this is a sham. You're not going to figure it out until it's too late. And some people still probably won't figure that out. But continuing, just look at Mr. Soros's IRS 990s, of which is $20 billion Open Society Foundation. And you can see the scale of the funding efforts to defeat everything from the free market system to the structure of the timeless nuclear family. Why destroy the family unit, you ask? Because Mr. Soros knows that the nuclear family has been the basis upon which every single stable civil society has been built since the beginning of time. It's why Marxist ideology also sought the demise of families composed of a mom and dad. Keep that phrase in mind as we go on. I'm going to introduce you to a few things, just some of the headlines of some of the articles that I'm going to introduce tonight. That should just keep that last paragraph in mind. So again, today's piece, in 1 year, George Soros poured 107 million reais into Brazilian NGOs by Gabriel G. Arruda Castro for the Gazeta do Povo newspaper or website. George Soros, the financier of left-wing groups around the world. You should all know who this guy is by now. The foundation led by billionaire George Soros transferred in just 1 year the equivalent of 107.2 million reais to organizations operating in Brazil. A survey carried out exclusively by Gazeta do Povo points out that 100 Brazilian NGOs received funds from Soros through the Open Society foundations founded by him. The total reached 19.9 million US dollars, so almost 20 million US dollars was worth 107 million reais in Brazil. At that time, obviously, the dollar had peaked at like $1 was worth about 5 reais at the time. I haven't looked at the exchange rate in a minute, but it hovered over the 5 real mark for a while. The figure in reais takes into account the average exchange rate for that year. The number is similar to that passed on in 2020 when 109 organizations received approximately $22 million, which was equal to 113 million Brazilian reais, taking into account the exchange rate at the time. Who George Soros finances in Brazil, the amount in reais, and order of those who received the most. So this is just like a list of all the foundations and organizations that George Soros has funded in Brazil. You can find this online. Like I said, it was over 100 organizations. Now, I didn't do a thorough investigation of all of these organizations. I just looked at some of the ones that I had heard of. This is just a small list of the ones that I would be interested in. These are like Black-oriented organizations. Boabá, Fundo, the Fund for Racial Equality, Gelade's, one of the most well-known Black women's feminist racial organization, the Gelade's Institute of Black Women. Let me see here, the Marielle Franco Association, of course, Marielle Franco being the Rio City Councilwoman who was savagely murdered in 2019, I think it was. What else? The Odada Institute of Black Women, the Instituto Ama. This is a company, or I don't know, I think it's an NGO, and they just talk about the issues of psychology, the psychosis of racism, and they talk about Black identity. One of my favorite sites, Alma Preta Jornalismo, Criolla, another Black women's organization. This is a feminist organization here. All of these are Black-oriented web, like either foundations or NGOs, which they call ONGs in Brazil. All of that information is available. Let me see if I can find that site real quick. Let's see. That's just the headline. Okay, here it is right here. Here's the full list. You just look at all of these NGOs that were funded by George Soros's Open Society Foundation. Okay. So again, depending on what side of the fence you're on, you may see this as, what's the big deal? That's a great thing. He's supporting, organizations that are going to bring about social change. But is that social change something that we really need? Is it something that you would support if you really? Well, I guess that depends on what your politics are. I see this as highly problematic. Let's keep this moving. Let's see. The account includes only projects focused on Brazil by Brazilian, the majority of them, and foreign entities. The volume of Soros's resources that arrived in the country tends to be even greater. This is because some entities have received from the Open Society to fund projects in more than one country at the same time. These cases were not included in the list made by Gazeta do Povo. The Washington office in Latin America, for example, received $1.9 million to operate in the region, but was not considered in the calculation because it is not possible to know how much of this money was actually invested in Brazil. Okay, so periodically, I'm going to just talk about some of these headlines that I found that, they kind of speak to some of the points that I'm making here. This is a YouTube video, and this is something that I've been hearing a lot of lately. This article says the LGBT agenda is not inclusive. LGBT agenda is not accepted by all homosexuals. And, I had the pleasure of speaking to, a friend of mine in Sao Paulo while I was actually when we visited Sao Paulo back in June. And he had, he's been in a stable relationship with his partner, I think more than probably 2 decades or so. I have no issue with them. They're very good people. And because we've had such deep conversations in the past, I felt, confident. I felt, open to ask him what he thought about the LGBT movement. And he openly said, it was like, look, I don't support the LGBT movement. They live as a very discreet couple. They're not, he said he participated in the Parada Gay one time, the LGBT, the gay parade in Sao Paulo, which is one of the biggest in the world. He says he doesn't support the LGBT agenda. It's like he says, what rights don't LGBT people have now? What is the point going over the top with all of these just blatantly outrageous marches that they do? Some of the public displays that they put on. He says he doesn't support that. He's like, let me lead my life, but he just and there's a lot of gay people. Perhaps a lot of these LGBT people, they're not heard because obviously the agenda is to promote the lifestyle. But you'll find a lot of LGBT people who don't actually support the mainstream LGBT movement. They think it's going out of control. Okay. Although there is no evidence that Soros's transfer of all of this money to these NGOs in Brazil, there's no evidence that this violates any law in Brazil. The billionaire's heavy investment raises questions about a possible imbalance in public debate in the country. Many of the entities funded by it produce reports and research that are later used to support decisions of the three powers. And some of the causes advocated by Soros are clear: the decriminalization of drugs, the promotion of the LGBT agenda, and the promotion of the most radical agendas of the Black movement are among them. Okay, so this is what I'm saying about if you look at what happens in the United States, then you make a comparison with Brazil, you see almost the identical same thing. Brazil has already long had what's called its movimento negro. This, what I call the Black movement. And, for the last few years, you've seen a lot of protests by Brazil's Black movement in the streets, using the signs that say Vidas Negras Importam, which means Black Lives Matter. Literally from Portuguese into English, that's what that means. Okay. So you see LGBT, feminist, and Black agendas going on in the United States are going to be almost identical to what you see going on in Brazil today. George Soros transferred more than 100 million reais to Brazilian NGOs in 1 year. This is another article from January 13th of 2023. In other words, Soros's interference, while apparently occurring within the law, helps fabricate false consensus and always in favor of quote unquote progressive flags. Among the Brazilian NGOs that received funds from Soros in 2021, the largest beneficiary was the Instituto Clima e Sociedade. The entity received US $1.5 million, which is just over 8 million reais. The NGO is led by Anna Toni, who chaired the board of Greenpeace International and was director of the Ford Foundation in Brazil. Like the Open Society Foundations, the Ford Foundation promotes progressive causes around the world. This is another piece from that same YouTube channel, and it asked a question: who finances leftist NGOs in Brazil? On his website, the Instituto Clima e Sociedade, which means Climate and Society Institute, claims to act in support of several local agents fighting for Brazil to avoid the negative impacts of global warming. In addition, the Institute often finances other organizations in Brazil. On the list are the Associação Nacional dos Procuradores da República, meaning the National Association of Attorneys of the Republic, the Memorial Chico Mendes, meaning the Chico Mendes Memorial, the Comissão Pastoral da Terra do Pará, meaning the Pastoral Commission of the Land of Pará, Pará being a state in the north of Brazil. This is a 2020 article by Jennifer Bilek, or Bilek, how you pronounce it, I'm not sure. The billionaires behind the LGBT movement. Ask yourself, why are billionaires supporting the LGBT movement? You know, people within the LGBT community should be asking this. Do you really believe that these billionaires have the interests of the LGBT at heart, or is there a deeper agenda going on here? One of the projects funded by the Climate and Society Institute is the construction of an eco-prophetic network in defense of the Amazon. The objective of the initiative is to build and strengthen collective communication campaign and engagement strategies in defense of the forest using narratives of faith. The grantee is an organization called Casa Galilea. Now, this is a steal from a YouTube video that I discovered maybe 6 months to a year ago. And pelo fim da família means for the end of the family. And what happened here is that this is a trans activist this person was one of the speakers at this, a seminar, I guess you could say. It was an open lecture. I don't know, maybe about 4 or 5 people on the stage. They were all seated. And this person just made the announcement, says, yes, we are in favor of the end of the family. So people can dismiss things that they see as just being conspiracy theory. But then when you hear somebody make an open announcement that way, what else do you do with that? This activist clearly said, like, yes, we are out to destroy, abolish the family. Okay. Nothing conspiracy theory about that. This is what this person said. Okay. Matter of fact, these are some videos that you can find on YouTube. I mean, for those of you who speak Portuguese, this first one says, we want to destroy the family. LGBT activist says, LGBT activist, yes, we want to destroy the family. If we want to destroy the family, yes, they want to. Okay. These are all taken off of the same announcement made by this trans activist. I think it was looks like January of 2020, right? As I said, you have conspiracy theory and then you have plain conspiracy. George Soros's Open Society, it supports, gender fluidity, radical racial politics and feminism. These are just some of the movements on the left that are getting funded by George Soros. Ask yourself, what is the agenda? When you looked at, I don't know if it's still up, but a couple of years ago, you could go to the Black Lives Matter website and it would openly tell you, for the progressive, like, abolition of the nuclear family, something to that degree. It's like, it's not a secret. So I just ask, because I know a lot of people who is involved in leftist politics come out of the church. And I'm like, okay, you're part of the church. Does this really fit with the politics that you were raised on? You really believe, coming out of a church background, that the destruction of the family is the way you're supposed to be going, particularly if you're coming from a Christian background? Good question for people to ask. I'd be willing to hear the answer on that. Instituto Alana, known for promoting progressive causes for children, also receives funds from Instituto Clima e Sociedade. In 2022, Alana maintained a project to analyze and highlight the public policy plan, including the climate policies of presidential candidates for children, producing content on the current scenario for the population, and carrying out a fact-checking work on issues that affect childhood. Another recipient of the resources of the Climate and Weather Institute in 2022 was the União Nacional dos Estudantes, meaning the National Students Union. The entity, which has been in the hands of the PCdoB, which the PCdoB, which means the Brazilian Communist Party. So the entity, the National Students Union, has been part of the Brazilian Communist Party for decades, and whose president, Bruno Berlas, campaigned for the election of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Brazil's current president in his third term, received money to engage young people for a conscious vote in defense of the Amazon and education. Support for extrication of prisoners. In third place among the large beneficiaries of George Soros in Brazil in 2022, with 2.7 million reais, is the Institute of Socioeconomic Studies. One of the organization's projects, the Map of Affections, guides merchants to respect gender identity in the bathrooms of their space. No need to go over that. This is a New York Times article. Let me see here. What does it say? George Soros, his foundation pours $220 million into racial equality push. What have we really seen of a racial equality push since the whole Black Lives Matter went into overdrive? I'm curious about that, besides the founders of that, or we'll say the invaders, the people who took over the Black Lives Matter movement, and how much money did they get for that? And we see that, what was it, $90 million or something in one particular year, and others, people are looking like, where did all that money go? This is a tweet from the PCE, or PCO, the Partido da Causa Operária. And it reads, this George Soros has his hands in all the Brazilian NGOs. Aniele Franco, for example, of the current PT, Workers' Party government, has an NGO financed by Soros. Now, Aniele Franco is the sister of Marielle Franco, the woman who was assassinated, the Rio City Councilwoman who was assassinated in a professional style hit in, like I said, 2018 or 2019. It's either been 4 or 5 years since her murder. And her sister rose up in her demise, and she's become very well known around the country, and her name is starting to get known on the international level also. She's part of Lula da Silva, Brazil's current president, in his third term. He was reelected, I think, in November of last year. And she's part of the Department of Racial Equality under the Lula government, okay? In fifth place, so Aniele's NGO is getting funded by George Soros. There's a number of Black organizations, just as I mentioned earlier, that are receiving funding from George Soros. I asked the question, is this a positive thing, or is there a hidden agenda there? I've already spoken about what are the goals of the open society. Now, keep this in mind, because a few days ago I was talking about something. The conservative, Afro-Brazilian conservative Paulo Cruz was talking about this, and he said something very much of what I've been saying for years. Why is it that the movement for Black people is mixed in the left with the feminist and the LGBT movement? Why is that? As if all of those movements are the same. Paulo Cruz pointed out an important point here. Politically, this is from a video I did a few days ago. The politically most powerful movements have more capacity to be perceived and make their agendas advance, including using the Black movements as a host, which can no longer talk about anti-racism without talking about LGBT phobia. So what's going on there? You've mixed all of the movements together. And so the activists of the Black movement have to automatically take in the talking points and the agendas of the other movements that's connected with the left. I mean, in my view, that's just not a good look. Why would you want to mix your movement with another movement and your agendas and the struggle that you're making is not necessarily the same thing? Oftentimes what I see with Black American movements in the United States is that other groups seem to advance their agendas. They get laws passed, they get protection by the government. And, Black people are still sitting there like, well, what about us? Remains to be seen. I'm curious to see what's going to happen with this mixing of leftist agendas in Brazil. In fifth place is what is it? Gajop, the let me see, the Office of Legal Counsel for Popular Organizations, based in Recife, which is in Brazil's northeast. The entity's mission is to defend and promote human rights with a focus on access to justice and security. Defend and promote human rights. Just curious about whose human rights. The organization has in its portfolio a program that strengthens family members of people deprived of liberty to face the impacts caused by the drug law. Brazil has its own war on drugs going on, with an emphasis on the structuring elements of inequality based on gender, race, and class. Gajopi, I think that's how you might pronounce it, is also a signatory of the National Agenda for Decarceration, which demands the suspension of any investment in the construction of new prison units. A lot of times I see these types of things, these agendas, what are the goals? And on the outside, they appear to be a good thing. But what is the flip side? Some of the things that I'm seeing coming out of this decarceration agenda says, we should free all criminals from the prisons. What do you think about that? I mean, Brazil has like the third or fourth largest prison population in the world. Some of those people are in jail unjustly, but some of those people are hardcore criminals. Do you want all of these people on the streets? Just something to think about. The list of open society beneficiaries in Brazil also includes the aforementioned Marielle Franco Association, the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Institute Foundation. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, for those of you who don't know, he was a famous sociologist in the 50s and 60s, and he became the president in Brazil between 1994 and 2002. The Getulio Vargas Foundation, the Brazilian Association of Investigative Journalism, and the Quebrando o Tabu, meaning the breaking the taboo page. Many of the entities benefiting from the open society in Brazil are also receiving contributions from other large foreign organizations. Gajopi, for example, is supported by the Oak Foundation and Der Sternsinger, an arm of the Catholic Church in Germany. CFEMIA receives from at least 5 other foreign entities, including the European Union and the Ford Foundation. The Mural Agency of the Peripheries has already maintained recent partnership with entities such as UNESCO, UNICEF, Facebook, and Twitter. Seeing the Ford Foundation having his fingers in the Brazilian pie, it just reminds me when I first started studying about racial politics in Brazil back in the early 2000s. And I would see just, article after article, huge PDF files that were, supported by the Ford Foundation. Here it is years later, and I'm looking at it like, what's the other side of this agenda? Sure, they pushed racial politics and the call for racial equality, but there's a much bigger agenda at play here. Something I'm like I said, I want to talk more about this in the future. For Giuliani Mioto, who is president of the Freedom and Justice Institute, an organization with a liberal profile, the number of Brazilian NGOs that receive funds from George Soros make it clear a disparity between the left and the right. An organization with a more right-wing proposition will hardly, if ever, have access to financing of such high value, he says. He's also a lawyer and a writer. Listen to what he said there. An organization that's more right-wing leaning will hardly ever have access to financing of such a high value. So ask yourself, as I've said it before, and I'll say it again, I can't really pin myself on the left or the right, but the question would be, why is it that George Soros' foundation seems to be supporting mostly leftist organizations, if not entirely leftist? What is the agenda? Let's talk about that in the future. Mioto says that this disparity distorts the debate in the country. The extensive funding of these organizations allows them to have a greater number of people dedicated full-time to the development of a so-called Overton window for their benefit. The Overton window is the set of ideas and values that are considered acceptable in a society. In Miyoto's opinion, entrepreneurs who identify with the right tend to donate only to election campaigns. In addition, according to him, there is a lack of a clear vision on the part of liberal and conservative Brazilians. The right in Brazil is still unaware of the importance of the work of think tanks and NGOs, he says. So anyway, I'm curious to know what you thought about this article today, this video. What do you think, based on what you might know about George Soros and his Open Society Foundation? What do you think about him investing heavily in Brazil's NGOs? Do you see this as a good thing? Is this, in the end, it's going to be positive for Brazil? Or is this part of a wider agenda to just overthrow society as we know it? You know, and using these three particular movements just like as pawns in order to move that agenda forward. I mean, how many more clues that we need that this is actually what's going on? I mean, call it conspiracy theory if you like, but all of the evidence that's coming out now, I just ask you make your own decision. So anyway, I'm going to end this particular article here, this particular video. I'm curious to know what you thought about this. Definitely drop a comment in the comment section. Consider subscribing to this channel if you've seen more than a few videos that you found interesting. Share this video, like this video, smash the notification bell so that you receive more intriguing videos as I continue to post them. And with that said, gonna end this video here and ask you to come by and check out my next video.